On November 12, 1955, a farmer in western Pennsylvania paused to watch a groundhog disappear into a burrow at the base of a low cliff. He knelt down and ran his fingers through the loose soil the animal had thrown out behind it. What came up in his hand was a piece of scorched bone. Beneath that little tunnel lay a hearth that had gone cold while glaciers still crushed Canada under a mile of ice. And for the next 50 years, American archaeology would tear itself apart, arguing about it. The farmer's name was Albert Miller. His family had held that piece of Washington County ground since 1795. It was a long stretch of soft, rolling farmland near the village of Avella. On one edge of the property stood a broad sandstone overhang leaning out over a small creek, a kind of natural stone canopy. Miller had always suspected people had sheltered under it in the distant past. That November afternoon, a groundhog handed him the proof. 12 inches down, he was already pulling up flint flakes, freshwater mussel shells, more burnt bone, and a whole stone knife. Then he did something almost nobody does. He filled the hole back in, not for a season, for 18 years. I have to stop on that for a moment. 18 years. I do not know many people who could stumble onto something that important and simply sit on it, silently, watching the seasons turn. And he did it for one reason. He was more afraid of losing the sight than of being ignored. He had no way of knowing that the thing he was quietly guarding would one day land on the front page of the Washington Post and drag him into the ugliest fight in his country's science. In the spring of 1973, a 29-year-old new faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh named James Adavasio was looking for somewhere to run a student field school. A local historian named Phil Jack mentioned a farmer with a rock shelter. Adavasio drove out, examined Miller's flint knife, and asked permission to dig that summer. Nobody expected much. Field schools are teaching exercises, students learning how to hold a trowel. Then the students kept going down and down. The deposits beneath that overhang were not a few feet thick. They were layered like the pages of a book, one occupation resting on the next, and every stratum they lifted pushed them further into the past. When the first radiocarbon results came back from Robert Stuckenrath's laboratory at the Smithsonian, the second season was still underway. On August 4th, 1974, the numbers made the front page of the Washington Post, because at that moment, every textbook in America agreed on one thing. The first people to reach this continent were the Clovis hunters, big game specialists who had crossed the Bering Land Bridge roughly 13,000 years ago, carrying a distinctive fluted spear point. That was not a theory, that was the rule. And the charcoal from the bottom of Albert Miller's groundhog hole was older. Over the seasons that followed, the excavation became one of the most meticulous ever conducted in North America. Adavasio wired the shelter with experimental lighting to reveal the tiniest changes in the stratigraphy. He ran a telephone line back to the Pittsburgh mainframe so every artifact could be plotted in 3 dimensions in real time. His students learned to lift the thinnest ancient surfaces with the edge of a single razor blade. In the end, the team pulled out more than 20,000 artifacts, around 150 separate hearths, and close to 1 million pieces of animal bone. They also recovered a slender, unfluted spear point that matched nothing in the Clovis toolkit. On July 31st, 1976, they named it the Miller Lancerlate, and they celebrated that night at a local bar in the farmer's honor. And they built a chronology that is still, half a century on, genuinely hard to argue with. More than 50 radiocarbon dates, arranged in almost perfect stratigraphic order, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. When I first read through that sequence, I remember assuming it had to be the end of the argument. More than 50 dates, all in order. It was not the end, it was barely the beginning. Because then came the response, and it was merciless. Leading it was Vance Haynes, the University of Arizona geologist who had spent his career dismantling early man claims across the American West. Haynes did not accuse anyone of lying. He said the ground itself had lied to them. Western Pennsylvania sits on coal country, and coal is carbon so ancient that it holds no measurable radiocarbon whatsoever. If even a trace of it had leached down into those charcoal samples through groundwater, whether as particulate dust or as dissolved humic acids, every date at the bottom of that hole would come back impossibly old without anyone having faked a single number. Then came a second objection, and it was worse. If humans really were camped under that overhang 16,000 years ago, they were sitting only 50 miles from the edge of an ice sheet a mile thick. The plants and animals around their fire should have been spruce and tundra, caribou and mammoth. They were not. They were white-tailed deer, squirrel, oak, and hickory. A temperate woodland, the wrong world entirely. Adavasio spent the next 30 years answering. Samples flew to Oxford for accelerator mass spectrometry, a far more precise dating technique, and the deep numbers held. An independent geomorphologist examined the sediments for any evidence of water percolation and found none. Adavasio pointed to a chalky mineral crust left behind by dissolved mussel shells, still perfectly intact across the shelter floor, and argued that serious seepage would have eaten straight through it. The critics answered with the chemistry of the humic acids in the charcoal. The argument never fully closed. It just quieted. And then Adavasio did something you almost never see from a man being called reckless. He became more cautious. In 1990, he and his colleagues published a chronology claiming only this: that people had been present in southwestern Pennsylvania by 14,000 to 14,500 years ago. Not an outrageous number, just an impossible one under the rules of the time. I think about that choice a lot. He was holding the most explosive site in the country, and he deliberately claimed less than he could have. That is not what someone does when he is chasing a headline. That is what someone does when he knows he is right, and he refuses to hand his enemies an easy target. And then the rules changed. In 1997, a delegation of the field's most senior skeptics, Vance Haynes himself among them, traveled to a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde, examined it with their own hands, and publicly conceded that it was older than Clovis. The wall came down. Since then, the evidence has piled up across 2 continents. At White Sands in New Mexico, human footprints pressed into an ancient lake bed have been dated by 3 independent methods: seeds, terrestrial pollen, combined with optical luminescence and radiocarbon on the surrounding lake mud, to somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. 55 consistent radiocarbon assays from multiple laboratories and 2 separate research groups now underpin them. If those tracks are what they appear to be, people were walking across New Mexico at the peak of the last glacial maximum, long before the ice-free corridor was even open. Meadowcroft was no longer the outlier. The discipline had simply taken half a century to walk to the exact spot where a Pennsylvania farmer had been standing since 1955. But the fight is not over. In March of 2026, a team led by Todd Suravel of the University of Wyoming published an argument in the journal Science that shook the field again. Their claim was that Monte Verde, the site that supposedly ended the Clovis First debate in 1997, is not late Pleistocene at all. They pointed to a volcanic ash layer buried beneath the deposit, and to signs of ancient stream reworking and place the occupation somewhere between 4,200 and 8,200 years ago. If they are right, the wall that came down in 1997 was never really a wall. 2 months later, 30 archaeologists struck back in the pages of the same journal. Tom Dillahay, Michael Waters, David Meltzer, and yes, James Adavasio himself. Waters called the new study egregiously poor geological work. Meltzer noted coldly that the samples had not even come from the archaeological layer. As of this year, the debate is not settled. It is louder than it has been in a decade, and that, in a way, is the point. Whatever Meadowcroft was trying to teach the field about paradigms, about the quiet stubbornness it takes to hold a controversial site together while your peers try to break it apart, that lesson is not something buried in the past. It is still being written, right now, in real time. In 2005, the Rockshelter was designated a National Historic Landmark. You can visit it, stand on a platform above the excavation, and look straight down into the hole where it all began. The groundhog got a name too. The staff call him Rocky, and he serves as the site's unofficial mascot. An animal who dug into one of the oldest human sites in North America, threw the evidence out behind him, and wandered off without ever knowing. What stays with me about Meadowcroft is not the dates, it is that the whole thing turned on a farmer who decided to wait, and an animal that had no idea what it was doing. And it is that the fight the site started, the fight over whether we let the evidence move us, or whether we bend the evidence back to fit what we already believe, is still right now being fought. So what does that mean for the rest of the ground under our feet? Somewhere out there, under a cornfield, under a highway, under someone's back garden, the next Meadowcroft is already waiting for something or someone to dig in exactly the right place. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.